Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's hearing titled Gulf War: What Kind of Care Are Veterans Receiving 20 Years Later? Yes, it has been over 20 years since the Gulf War. I remember very well, having been there myself as a Marine Corps officer. Now, as chairman of this subcommittee, I am asking the same questions many fellow Gulf War veterans have, namely, how is this unique set of veterans being treated by the VA? Well, it may be pretty easy to determine whether a veteran served in the Gulf War. It has been difficult for some time to accurately identify what constitutes Gulf War illness. However, a lot of people, both in the veteran community and the medical community, agree that it exists. In fact, VA's current Chief of Staff, John Gingrich, once made the following comment about Gulf War illness, quote, "While commanding an artillery battalion during the Gulf War I, one of my soldiers suddenly became quite ill. Despite the best efforts of our medical team, they could not diagnose what made him so sick. Out of 800 soldiers under my command, no one else was that sick. Now, here we are, almost 20 years later, and this veteran is still suffering and has been since the war. I have watched him when he could barely stand up, couldn't cross the room on his own. His legs were so weak. He has been in and out of hospitals many times, seen by some of the best doctors, and yet there is no explanation for his debilitating illness. And this veteran is not alone," unquote. Chronic multi-symptom illness, or CMI, is by its own definition not just one item that a VA physician can look for. However, there are certain things a VA physician can and should look for in determining whether a veteran likely has CMI that can be attributed to service in the first Gulf War. This should be a straightforward process. However, I'm concerned that it is not happening in practice. This hearing today is not about whether Gulf War illness exists. This hearing is about how it is identified, diagnosed, and treated, and how the tools put in place to aid these efforts have been used. For example, is the Gulf War Registry working as intended and being used properly? If not, what is VA doing to fix the problem? And what can this committee do to help VA in that effort? Are the findings of the Research Advisory Committee being put to use in identifying, diagnosing, and treating those veterans suffering from Gulf War illness? If not, where is the disconnect? How can this committee help VA better assist these veterans? We have learned a lot in the last 20 years. Science and research has identified unique medical issues for the veterans of the Gulf War and established baselines from which we can gain a better understanding of those unique issues. Gulf War illness has significant physical effects on the lives and well-being of those veterans, and we need to make sure that VA can and does make every effort to accurately identify, diagnose, and treat them in a timely fashion. To be sure, it should not take another 20 years for us all to get this right. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses on what is working in treating Gulf War illness, where problems remain, and how the entire process can be improved. With that, I yield to Ranking Member Kirkpatrick for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because we know that the deployment experience of our veterans is especially important in the world of research and the care and treatment of injuries and illnesses, I want to thank you for holding this hearing on Gulf War veterans and the progress or not of recognizing and treating these veterans for ill-defined and undiagnosed conditions. It is estimated that up to 35% of veterans who have served in the Gulf War suffer from symptoms that are not readily identifiable or well understood. In the Institute of Medicine's report released just this past January, and on which this hearing is based, these conditions are called chronic multi-symptom illness, or CMI. Veterans from the 1991 Gulf War have struggled for more than 2 decades to dispel the all too often accusation that it's all in your head. Veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have recently presented to the Veterans Health Administration with similar symptoms and have joined their fellow veterans in the fight for effective treatments and legitimate recognition of CMI by providers. Keeping the struggle of this generation of veterans in the forefront of this subcommittee is not just important, but crucial for us as a nation to finally look at service in combat not so narrowly as just that span of time served in combat, but to look at the whole experience of the service member from the perspective of pre-deployment, deployment, and post-deployment as the sum total of things that have happened to a service member. Hopefully this hearing will provide us a better perspective and a more holistic approach in understanding their unique needs and the full toll that serving takes on everyone. In this way, we are better able to contribute to their healing and readjustment. I think it is incumbent upon us to learn as much as we can about what our nation is asking for our service members and families when they volunteer and raise their right hand. We must recognize and be prepared to address the consequences of that service and bring to bear our best efforts to ensure that they are thoroughly prepared to serve, and when they return home, we commit to making them whole again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick. I ask that all members waive their opening remarks as per this committee's custom and invite the first panel to the witness table. I see you there. On this panel, we will hear from Dr. Leah Steele, Research Professor of Biomedical Studies and Director of the Veterans Health Research Program at Baylor University, Dr. Stephen S. Coughlin, Adjunct Professor of Epidemiology at Emory University, Dr. Bernard M. Rossoff, Chairman of the Board of Directors at Huntington Hospital and Chair of the Committee of Gulf War and Health, Treatment for Chronic Multi-Symptom Illness at the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies. And finally, from Mr. Anthony Hardy, a Gulf War veteran himself. All of your complete written statements will be made part of the hearing record.